Good afternoon, everyone, and we appreciate all of you that have joined us today. Just want to get started in the life in healthcare. We've had a few glitches starting out, so our moderator, Jessica Weldon, is having some challenges, so I'm going to kind of take over from there. But just to kind of get started, some quick housekeeping duties here. I want to let everybody know that we'll be recording this event. It will be available after the webinar is posted, so please feel free to look out for that. And with that, I'm going to jump right into this and get into our presenters. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Rod Kersch. I've been in healthcare for well over 30 years, and on the payer side of things, over a decade. A lot of that in the Medicare, Medicaid space. Was involved in a lot of the first developments from a supplemental benefit position that I'm very proud of, the Flex Cards and Healthy Foods programs that are out there today. And recently I've taken on a project that we're calling the Campfire Research Project, where I'm traveling across the country in a camper and a pickup. My wife at times think I've lost my mind, but after the pandemic, I read a lot about how a lot of the seniors were living and traveling through the camper and campsite lifestyle. So I felt I wanted to get close to them and understand their feelings about Medicare, the good, bad, and ugly. So I've been doing that and interviewed almost 2,500 people to date, and want to add a little bit that today. But with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Jared, who is actually a genius at the analyst position, and I'm sure many of you follow him on here as well as I do, and that's where I go to get a lot of my data and statistics to make our decisions from. So with that, Jared, I'm going to turn it over to you and then let you roll into the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Rod. Glad to be here. Yeah, Jared Strock, principal and consulting actuary with Telos Actuarial, and then also have a newsletter called Medicare Market Insights, and post a lot of content on LinkedIn where Rod and I met. So happy to be here. It's always fun to talk about health insurance and Medicare and kind of where things have been and where things are going. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. Really talk about some trends in the Medicare space in general. And so, oh yeah, there's our pictures. So you already saw us, but see us again. And then, all right, so state of the Medicare market. That's really what I'm going to talk about today. And really the agenda, first, why do we care about the Medicare market? So a reminder on that. What did AEP 2025 look like? So kind of looking back at, the past AEP, what has happened in the Medicare space since, and then really look at AEP 2026 and things to kind of watch for, kind of looking ahead, and then hopefully some time for a Q&A. So why do we care about the Medicare market? This is my dad, and he's a cattle rancher, sheep and cattle rancher in Wyoming. Some of my best memories growing up, riding with him in a tractor, listening to country music with his dog. But my dad is 72, and he is just now getting into the Medicare market. He's been on my mom's employer plan until now, and so he's been calling me, asking me questions about what type of product he should get. And I spend all my time in this space, and I found that his questions are hard. I don't always know the answer. So obviously we all have somebody like this in our lives who we care about, who means a lot to us, and who is navigating the Medicare market. And Rod has a bunch of stories that I'm sure he could share, and he will share at some point in the future, on just people, right? We care about it because there's people who are navigating this space and who value these products. We also care about the Medicare market because of this chart. This is showing U.S. births going back in time. The bump right there in the middle is the baby boom that we always talk about. Those who were born in 1960, which is right in the middle of that first bump in the graph, they're turning 65 this year, and so you can see we still have a lot of baby boomers to come, and then the trend continues. And so there's a lot of people who are obviously needing Medicare products and value those products. As a result, this comes from a white paper that we put out at Telos called "The Future of Medicare Supplement," but it's showing that that top green line is the projected Medicare Advantage enrollment over the next 10 years. The dashed line is where we're at today, and you can see that it's expected that the Medicare Advantage market will continue to grow. In addition, the dark blue line is Medicare Supplement. So, Medicare Supplement maybe doesn't get a lot of the headlines, but there still are, 14 million individuals who are, have original Medicare and also have a Medicare Supplement. And we expect and project that that will also continue to grow over the next 10 years, maybe not at the same rate. But so bottom line, there's a lot of people who have Medicare products today, and over the next 10 years, that number will keep growing. So that's why we care about, obviously, why we care about the Medicare market and why it's important to all of us here on this webinar today. Okay, so now looking back at AEP 2025, just kind of want to, wrap up some of the results that we saw in 25 and how that kind of relates to what's going to happen going forward. So first of all, this is showing how AEP 25, what the enrollment increase was. Seeing the bolded line, you can see that around 500,000 individuals, the enrollment grew by half a million individuals, or 1.3%. And as you can see, this was actually down quite a bit from the prior handful of years. There's a few things there. One, the reality is that as you grow and as you saturate a market, it does become harder to continue growing at the same rate. So that's probably part of it. As you think about why did the market grow less in AEP 25 for Medicare Advantage? Part of it's that, but part of it is also related to insurance carriers' kind of financial results recently. And so the next few slides are looking at some of the publicly traded insurance carriers and their 2024 results. A few kind of things to point out here. One is the MLR. So that row is showing the medical loss ratio. And really a loss ratio is just how much of the revenue that the company brings in do they send out the door and use to pay for the medical costs associated with that insurance product. So as you can see, if you combine all of these public carriers together in 2024, their loss ratio was 88%, which you'll see on the next slide is up, from the prior few years, but that's a pretty high loss ratio. And so overall, their operating profit margin, if you combine them all together again, was 3.3%, which is a little bit lower than typical. You can also see some of the specific carriers. I'll point out Humana and CVS. Specifically, their loss ratios were even on the higher end compared to their competitors, and their profit margins on the lower end. That's important as we think about how carriers' results happened in AEP 25. So this is showing the change. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to interject a few things as we went along to compare. You're pulling a lot of data from the health plans itself. I'm pulling a lot of data. Well, all my data is coming directly from the member. And I'm seeing a lot of what you're demonstrating here on the slides, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on the Medicare Advantage seems to be slowing down, and traditional is kind of picking up. And I'm seeing that in the member position, but I'm seeing that with their responses being they're frustrated because of the pre-authorization. But there's been a lot of, well, they pulled the MA plan from my demographics, and there's been some challenges there. But what are you seeing from the plan side of it? Is it the same reason they're seeing, or is it a lot of with monetization that they're starting to transition and try to push people into other plans to create better finances? So I was just curious on what your thoughts and what your findings were on that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So I do think, I think this is kind of pointing to what carriers did this last AEP and really probably what consumers experienced a little bit, which was, okay, they're struggling from a financial standpoint. So this chart in particular is showing that change for the carriers in operating profit loss and how the MLR increased. And so what the plans ended up doing because of this last AEP is kind of highlighted in this chart, which will get to your question as we go. So this comes from Milliman, and it's showing how Medicare Advantage plans change their benefits per member per month from one year to the next. And so you can think about it as like the value that the consumer sees from these plans. And so if you go back kind of prior to 2022 and you looked at this chart, pretty much every year for quite a while, the value that the consumer saw actually increased each year. And so you can see from 2022 to 2023, which is the bottom section, the value that Medicare Advantage increased by was $22 per member per month. You can see from 23 to 24 is pretty much flat. And then last year from 24 to 2025, the overall value that consumers saw in their Medicare Advantage plans actually decreased. And so part of it's that, I think consumers felt that with some of their plans, like, oh, we have this product that we've had, but the value of the benefits is actually going down. And so that's one of the reasons, maybe consumers were open to shopping. The other one goes to what you just said, and that's this last AEP, 7% of the Medicare Advantage market of members of Medicare Advantage products lost their plan going into 2025. It's typically 1%. Typically there's always some sort of plan terminations, service area reductions, but typically it's more like 1% of enrollees have one of those happen. This last AEP it was 7%. So really, I think the consumers that you talk to probably experience some or both of those things. Either their plan terminated, whether it's a full termination or it's just they removed it from my county, or they just experienced, hey, I have the same plan, but the benefits are reducing. And so obviously more likely for consumers then, if one of those happens, to kind of shop around and maybe go back and look at original Medicare. Okay, so health plan results this last AEP. I mentioned that Humana and CVS kind of pointed out that they had much higher loss ratios and lower profitability. Going into last year's AEP, they really kind of communicated and signaled, hey, we're going to pull back and we need to focus on profitability. And so as a result, I'll go to this slide first. This last AEP, both of them actually, their overall enrollment in Medicare Advantage actually declined. You can see they're the two on the bottom. They really kind of strategically did this by doing some of what I've just mentioned, where they, removed plans or had service area reductions on some of their plans in certain markets. On the flip side, going into last year's AEP, both United and Elevance really kind of communicated and signaled, hey, we like where we're at. And so they had less of that kind of movement in terms of they had, less and fewer plan terminations. I think their benefits were a little bit more competitive. As a result, they were two that really grew the most during last year's AEP. There are also some kind of surprises on this chart. One in particular is Medical Mutual of Ohio as an example of a company that they're a very small local health plan that grew, they grew so much that they're in the top 10 of nationwide growth this last AEP in this table. And really, they were one company that stopped paying commissions kind of mid AEP because my read on it is they were actually growing too much and kind of saw like, hey, it's great that we're growing, but we actually don't know that we can support all these new members, and loss ratios are already high. How's that going to impact us? So it's kind of interesting that there were also some smaller or regional plans that also grew quite a bit this last AEP. From a plan type perspective, and I think this is important as we think about going forward, HMOs grew the most, and PPOs, the total enrollment in PPO plans declined. And if you were to look at this, the prior AEP, it was flipped. So PPOs, prior to this last AEP, were growing quite a bit. I think, they were sort of popular plans with consumers. PPOs have, less strict networks. And so if you think about just a consumer who maybe they travel to Arizona for the winter or whatever, a PPO plan is kind of attractive to them. On the flip side, for the carriers, because there's less of a network, they can't sort of manage the care quite as much, and so as a result, this last AEP, that's where a lot of the plan terminations and service area reductions happened, was in PPO plans, and more focus has been put on HMO plans by the carriers. So as a result, those grew while PPOs shrunk. In addition, we saw a big growth in C-SNPs. These are chronic special needs plans. Historically, kind of over the last handful of years, D-SNPs have really been the big growth area in Medicare Advantage, due to some changes that there are in D-SNPs kind of in 2025 and going forward. Really, there's been a shift in focus to C-SNPs by several carriers, and this last AEP saw significant growth in that plan type.
So, quick question for you on that. I've read in some articles where C-SNPs rose as much as 40% last year. In your actuarial studies recently, do you see that trend continuing, especially with the continuation of the chronic state of the population base?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, and this slide shows kind of the continued growth throughout 2025. So the big increase towards the right of the graph is AEP, but then you can see it keeps growing. And just as an FYI, this is showing C-SNP growth by health plan, and so United Healthcare has definitely been kind of the main company really expanding their C-SNP offerings across the country, and has grown the most for sure. But Elevance and Humana, I think, are the other two that stood out. But you can see here that those have continued to grow throughout 2025. So it wasn't just AEP. And I do, to your point, there's a big percentage of the senior population has at least one chronic condition. And so there is an opportunity. I think carriers are seeing there's an opportunity to design plans that meet those needs particularly. So it really serves those individuals who have some chronic conditions, provides benefits that are valuable to them. And also really the aim would be to help improve their health. If you can provide benefits and services that actually over a long term help improve their health outcomes, it's kind of a win-win. And so I do think, I think there's a big opportunity. I want to say that I've done a few studies just looking at the penetration by state of C-SNPs, and I think the highest state has like a 14% penetration. So if you look at just C-SNP as a divided by the total MA, I think 14% is the highest that we've seen right now, and I think the total market is something like 3 or 4%. So there's a big, if every state was 14%, there's a lot of kind of room to grow there. So I do think that'll be a continued focus.
And a little bit further reach and caveat off that to further advance it. How do you see things like, we all know that in the Medicare space, the VBID is going away, and you're talking about millions of members that are on some type of a VBID program. It looks like SSBCI programs are going to stay in play, but those people that are currently acquiring some type of service through the VBID program, do you see that affecting some of the special needs programs and increasing them over the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big special needs plan that has some headwinds is D-SNPs, the duals. There's kind of a few reasons. One is that you just mentioned, and kind of related to that is that there's definitely been a push from CMS and some of the special enrollment period changes to D-SNPs, where there's more focus on, hey, we want we want these D-SNP plans to be integrated with, Medicaid and Medicare. And so the special enrollment period, historically was a quarterly special enrollment period for D-SNPs, and it didn't really matter what type of D-SNP the individual could switch once a quarter if they wanted to. That has been removed and has been in its place as a monthly special enrollment period. But it's only in the case where somebody switches to or between one of those fully integrated plans where they're, Medicaid and Medicare are coordinating the care. So that's kind of the big change in D-SNPs. The other, I guess, change that I see kind of longer term is, the bill that was just passed really removed some funding from Medicaid. And I think the CBO estimated, that it was something like 1 million of the D-SNP enrollees may go away because of that. So I do think that the D-SNPs have some headwinds, and that's the other reason I think C-SNP has become kind of the new plan that a lot of carriers are focusing on.
Thank you.
So what's happened since AP? I wanted to hit on this. We've been talking about Medicare Advantage, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a big chunk of consumers that have Medicare supplement products as well. And, the trend, there's been a few trends we've been seeing in that market. One has to do with open enrollment guarantee issue rules. So specifically, there's a rule called the birthday rule that has been expanding across the country pretty quickly. And the birthday rule allows an individual on their birthday to have an open enrollment or guarantee issue period around their birthday where they can switch to a different Medicare supplement product without going through underwriting. Historically, and there's still a lot of states that are like this, you have your open enrollment period when you first turn 65. You may have some other guarantee issue rights related to other events, but typically if you want to switch to a new carrier and a new product, you'd have to go through underwriting. So what we've been seeing is that there's a trend of this birthday rule expanding throughout the country. You can see there's a few states that are still pending. And this next slide kind of shows the growth over time. So you can see 2025, there were a handful of states that added the OEGI or birthday rule to their state. And then you've got a state that looks like it's going to come live in 2026, and then you have a few pending. So that's a big trend we've seen. And, the impact obviously to the consumer is generally positive, where they're not going to be stuck in a plan. They can switch once a year. On the flip side, from the carrier's perspective, that really increases the risk, kind of claims cost risk for them. And so as a result, what we typically see in these markets where there is a birthday rule is that fewer carriers enter the market. So there's fewer options for consumers. And also the premium rates have to go up in order to kind of pay for not being able to underwrite. So that's kind of playing out over time, and will continue to. The other thing go ahead.
It's interesting you bring that up because obviously in 22, 23, 24 with my Campfire project, it was very obvious that there was a big push on Medicare Advantage, and that was kind of the stable conversations I was having. You could see the growth in it, and Medicare tradition was flatline. But this year, it's very interesting. I've interviewed about 350 people so far this year, and it's very interesting how more than ever, and I mean it's blatantly obvious that there's a lot of transitioning going on, and that transition actually, Sharon, I don't know if you're seeing this in your numbers, but in the people I've talked to, there's a lot of transition from Medicare Advantage back to a traditional Medicare program. It's over 50% of the people I've talked to that were in a Medicare Advantage program have transitioned out of the Advantage program back to a traditional with a gap plan.
Yeah, and most of them you would say would add like a Medigap or a Medicare supplement plan from what you.
Yeah, the gap, F and G are very, very popular right now. And it's funny that the graph you bring up is one of my first big tours here was through Nebraska and Wyoming and Colorado and Idaho. And there was a lot of transition with the folks that I was able to interview through those areas.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it is interesting. Like they're probably going to be paying a little bit more premium than they would have, 5 years ago. But just that choice and the stability of Medicare supplement is a big positive, right? They know that if they keep paying their premiums, they're going to keep having the product. Whereas Medicare Advantage can kind of can change every year, and carriers can drop the plan if they want. That's not true of Medicare supplement. So there's just more stability in that market, which, anytime things are a little bit chaotic, that stability sounds nice, right?
Well, that's what my curiosity is. How much of that transition is created by frustration in the plans by the members, and how much is created by the leniency or the availability now to be able to do it?
Yep. And probably from their perspective, the birthday rule, for example, is a positive, right?
Yeah.
They know that once a year they'll be able to switch to a different Medicare, Medigap plan. On the flip side, the other thing we are seeing in the Medicare supplement space is much higher rate increases. Medicare supplement is similar to Med Advantage, is also experiencing higher loss ratios, and as a result, having to take higher rate increases. And I expect that to kind of continue for a bit. The other thing that's happened since AEP is the MA rate announcement. So this is showing how much more revenue from one year to the next MA carriers can expect. And you can see that 2026 is a 5.06% increase on average. And this is up significantly from the prior few years. So overall, that's good news for carriers and for the market. Like the plans will be getting more revenue per member for Medicare Advantage as we head into 2026. In addition, it's sort of tied to that number. MA brokers and agents are also getting, more commissions. At least the max commission amount is going up 10.8% in 2026. So, you could look at it a few ways. One way is like carriers are going to be getting more money from CMS. They're also going to have to pay a little bit more in commissions. But that's another thing happening in 2026. Continued medical loss ratio pressure and profitability pressure. I like this graph. It shows the market capitalization of publicly traded Medicare companies over time. The top section is United Healthcare. They make up a big chunk of it. But you can see that the market caps for these carriers, for these companies in 2025 is down significantly from the prior few years. And that really just highlights these companies are experiencing some pressure from a financial standpoint. I'd say I would add in, like, even just from a regulatory standpoint, Department of Justice standpoint, there's just pressure and focus on these companies. And as a result, kind of the value of the market capitalization value of these companies is down. And so, the other thing that we've heard from companies or some signals that we've seen, earlier on I was showing AEP 25, United Healthcare and Elevance grew the most. They've really been signaling this year that they are probably going to be pulling back this next AEP. So one example is United Healthcare stopped paying commissions on certain plans starting July 1st. Elevance really pulled back marketing their Medicare Advantage plans in 2025, kind of post AEP. They pulled them from enrollment platforms. And then in quarter two, in United Healthcare's Q2 financial results, they kind of announced that they were going to drop plans this next AEP that would impact 600,000 individuals. So you can see that there's already some kind of signals as we look to 26 that there's going to be some additional pullback from carriers in the MA space. Which brings me to kind of, things to watch in 2026. Like I just mentioned, carriers continue facing pressure, higher loss ratios, lower profitability, and really, I expect them to continue to focus on profitability above growth. Now, I think, the market is always changing and shifting, and there's always places where companies can grow. So there may be some that really say, hey, there's kind of an opportunity here for us. But in general, I think profitability is the focus for companies. I definitely think there will be some additional plan terminations, service area reductions this next AP. United Healthcare already kind of announced that they were going to do that. I could see Elevance possibly doing some of that, and really, there's probably going to be other carriers that do this in order to focus on profitability once again. I expect continued C-SNP expansion. The Medicare supplement birthday rule we talked about, that's going to keep expanding across the United States. There's constantly kind of new states that are bringing that before their legislature to add those rules. The other thing we didn't talk a lot about was just Part D changes. The Inflation Reduction Act really made a lot of changes to Part D, which as a result puts more burden on the carriers. And so therefore they're having to do things like increase premiums, change formularies, et cetera. And so kind of you put all that stuff together, and really the bottom line is it's going to be another year as we head into 2026 AP of just higher than normal shopping, switching activity. There's going to be more consumers that, as Rob mentioned, are going to get, letters from the carrier saying, hey, your plan is no longer going to be available, or hey, your benefits are being reduced, or if you're a MedSup company, enrollee, you're getting a rate increase that's higher than normal. So combine all that together, another year of higher than normal shopping and switching, which obviously for us kind of in the industry, means work for us, means we need to be ready to kind of help navigate the industry, or if you're in the distribution space, help those consumers really figure out what's best for them, so on and so forth. But that is what's next.
A couple of pretty general things I want to throw at you just and get your perspective, and I think people on this webinar would like to get your perspective. Jared, first of all, just from a very high level, it used to be the 80-20 rule up until last year that you had two big dogs. You had United and Humana, and obviously it was very financially advantaged to them, and they were growing and advertising and pushing hard. Now you come to 24 and 25, and it seems like there's a pullback and there's a breakup a little bit. It's kind of like we do in our economy, how every 8 or 10 years we go through a cycle where there's a downturn. Do you see this as just kind of a common turn where there's some right sizing of the marketplace, and the big two are having to kind of right size, and it's going to open up some opportunity for some other regional players to come in and fill those gaps?
Yeah, it's a good question.
7.
It's a good question. I mean, one thing we did look at when we looked at AP 25 results, I didn't show any of this, but we did try and look at, okay, how did the big carriers, regional carriers and local carriers, how did their enrollment change? And we did see that some of the local and regional carriers, if you kind of combine them into buckets, actually grew more than the large carriers from a percentage basis, obviously not from account basis. So I do think that this last AP, some of that did happen. I guess I would say that this kind of, a couple companies grow more one year, and then they kind of pull back the next year, and then some other companies kind of grow more the next year. There is sort of a cycle at play, and I do think part of it's just that. Last AP, so 24 AP, CVS grew the most, right? And so they were one on the chart this AP where they actually shrunk. So there's kind of this cycle of like, okay, we're from a competitive standpoint, we have really competitive plans, we're going to grow, but now we need to now we're going to focus on profitability. And so I think some of it's just a cycle where some will pop up, some will pop back down. I do think it's highlighted because of the margin pressure that they're all facing. So it just kind of highlights it more. But I do think, generally speaking, it's kind of a cycle.
And I realize there's a monetization to any business you're in. But in my experience out there with the members director, speaking across the campfire, I mean, there's 3 basic things that came across very prevalent this year that were around somewhat in the last 2 or 3 years, but this year it's been highlighted in my exposure. And that is, there's a lot of frustration and transitioning due to pre-authorization, especially in the Medicare Advantage realm. The second was rate creep. A lot of these people are on fixed incomes. There's a lot of frustration and complaint about that they just can't absorb some of this. $50, $80 a month increases that adds up to 800 to 1,000 a year. When you're on a fixed income, that's hard to digest and absorb. And then the third was there is a feeling out there this year more than I've ever seen. I didn't even see this the last couple of years, but there is a strong feeling by members out there that they feel that this is almost like predestined, like the plans and the government has developed this together to reposition Medicare. So there's some frustration. I think there's some people transitioning just due to that. They're really not frustrated with their broker or their plan so much. They're just frustrated with the changes. And I've seen that more this year. But one other question I have too, and that goes to the brokers. I know we have some brokers online here, and in past years, it has been very heavy that the members have utilized the broker to sign up. And whether they're frustrated with what they signed up for or getting what they asked for when they signed up, the broker is held in high review. I mean, to the point of 88% of the people I've interviewed in past years held the broker in either high or very high esteem. And this year that's fallen off. I mean, the ratings are averaging 6 to 7 rather than 8 to 9s. How much of that do you think is based on just transition in the environment? And second piece of that question is, do you think this rate change is going to help the broker reestablish their footholding with the members out there?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know if some of it just has to do with the fact that, more members are experiencing all those changes from their health plans. Maybe some of the benefits being pulled back, maybe their plans being terminated, whether it's the high rate increases, they're experiencing that, and therefore they're almost like associating some of that with their broker. Even though the broker doesn't necessarily, have much to do with any of that stuff, they're just trying to help them navigate to the right plan. So that's interesting that some of that has come down a little bit. I do think that the increase in broker comp obviously helps. The brokers, allows them to potentially spend more time with each individual. Potentially allows them to use some additional technology that aids in helping figure out which plan is sort of the right plan for that member, based on networks and what drugs they take and all that. I do think there are a lot of tools out there that, if used right, can be very helpful. So, hopefully it's like for the brokers and the agents, they're assuming they get some of that increase in pay. The hope would be that they put a lot of that back into helping the members, as opposed to just holding on to it themselves. And I think most brokers and agents, that's what they do. They care about the people. They probably have a father or a friend or a grandpa who's, just like my dad is navigating. And so really what they care about is helping them make good decisions. So I'm hopeful that the increase in their comp really gets pushed to helping the members.
And I've been in conversations with all kinds of titles across the plan space. And one of the interesting things is, paying brokers fees is obviously a monetary expense. And so that is challenging. But one of the things you started this program with, why do we do it? And you brought up your dad. And I love that story. You got family members. I got family members that are aging in. Heck, I'm going to be aging in here, in a few years. So it's concerning. And the one thing I've found out there, the 20-some hundred that I've interviewed, I can't tell you one person that sat in front of me and claimed to feel that they are comfortable with understanding their Medicare plan. And I've talked to people that have doctorates, to people that had to quit and go to war in World War II out of the 10th and 11th grade. So I've talked all across the board. So the people is why we're doing it. And I've started to talk about how we talked in the provider side of care years ago about how we wanted to help you take care of that patient from cradle to grave. And I think we need to do that more in the Medicare space. We need to create an avenue to help these people. They paid into this for a lifetime, to give them a product that takes them from the time they age in to the time they die, and make it easy for them. And I think it's important that we develop that. And I'm getting to a point here. One of the biggest things is this year I didn't ask this question in previous years, but I asked the question to all 300 something I've interviewed so far: would more education, be appropriate, and would you accept that? All 100% so far said yes, they would like more education. And a majority over the 20 some hundred I've interviewed have been asked less than 10 questions to be put in a plan. I think we need to get better at it, and that's where I'm coming to a broker situation. Is I think the brokers, the more I think about this, and I want to get your thoughts on it too, is we need to get the member more educated so they're more a part of the decision. And in my mind, now that I think about it, the broker's a key avenue to get that there. If we can help the brokers, make what they need to make and be able to spend the time with the member they need to spend with the education knowledge, we can make a more knowledgeable member and be more involved in their decision. So that's why I asked this question. I'm hoping that the extra payout will help us get us there. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. I think the broker's such a key piece now in how we manage that member. They've already got the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you. This last year, I was helping my grandmother-in-law. She's on original Medicare and was looking to maybe switch to Medicare Advantage. And so she asked if I could help her. I'm not a licensed broker or agent, so I was helping more with research and information. And it's funny, I actually went out to a bunch of different websites, put in all her information, and these specific websites kind of came back with here's the recommendations, and they were all different, which was wow. So we have these AI type things that are taking all data in and kind of giving you some recommendations, and they're all different, which obviously is not very helpful because then you just don't really know. And so the next step was okay, I'm going to call a local agent broker. We called him, and it was immediately provided value and help, right? He understood the kind of the networks around. I live in Omaha. He understood the Omaha, provider systems. He understood which plans and how the networks, worked with each one of those plans. And it was immediately beneficial and helpful and provided all the needed kind of information that, I was able to provide some of that, and use some kind of cool tools to help. But really that experienced agent helped her navigate, figure out what she needed to do.
They're a perfect avenue, in my opinion. People that work with me are probably getting sick of me beating the education drum, that somehow we got to get, simpler, better educational tools in the people's hands that can get to the members and just fill them up with more knowledge so they become more of the decision process. Because I can't tell you, I tell people this all the time, the common experience I have is you get in front of these people over a campfire and you say, well, what kind of Medicare did you sign up for? And they'll tell you, well, how's it working for you? Yeah, it's okay. Or, well, how'd you sign up for it? Well, I used my broker. Okay, what do you think of your broker? Well, in typical, they'll say, we love our broker. They're either a friend or relative or, referred to them, and they love them. They'll, rate them high. But then again, they're not totally satisfied. So that tells me they're not enough a part of the decisions. So I think we need to get them there. Any ending thoughts from your perspective, Jared?
I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I think it'll be another interesting AP, where there's a lot of kind of activity and movement going on. I'm excited to kind of hear more about, as you kind of release some of your research on your interviews with specific members. I'll just be interested to see kind of what you're finding you shared some of it today, but what you're finding in your experience, because I think it's in some ways going to be a little bit of a repeat this next AP, just with some different players, right, having more of the changes. So yeah, it'll be another wild AEP.
Yeah, I think your hard numbers are matching up with what my member exposure is coming back as. It's going to be, it's going to be another tumultuous year and a lot of unpredictability on where things move to. With that, I don't know, Kayla, if we have any questions out there for Jared. Jared, we do have a couple questions here for you, so we're going to make you stick around a little bit longer. They're asking for health plans developing their 2026 strategies right now. What's one immediate actionable step they can take based on the trends we've discussed?
Whew. That's a good question. Yeah, I guess I would say one thing is that, a lot of these plans are already submitted to CMS, and they're, now that some of the funding and all that's known from CMS, there are some changes. But I mean, I think the actionable step, really is, obviously plans are focused on profitability, by, overarching. But I think one thing that's a smart strategy for plans is to look at that kind of more granularly. So, there may be a plan in one state or county that, for whatever reason, whether it's kind of the network or whatever, they don't have great profitability, but they may in some other counties and some other states that may be a perfectly great plan. And so, kind of that strategic, granular look at things, I think, is important. The other one that I don't know, that I kind of think, and I would say carriers and plans have this view as well, but having a long-term view of things, right? I mean, it does seem like over the last year there's been a lot of kind of, feels like reactionary. So, pulling commissions for specific plans, midstream, seems very reactionary and short-sighted. And so, what is kind of the balance between that and like a long-term view? Because we know that the Medicare space is going to grow over the next 10 years, and so, what kind of like benefits and relationships are important for the next 10 years and not just this specific AEP. Yeah, admittedly, we don't help plans develop MA products, so I'm maybe not the right one to ask specifics on benefits and that sort of thing, but it's a good question.
I'm going to ask a lead off that's more specific. And one of the most confusing conversations I have out there with members is over HMO and PPO. Where do you see the heavier, if you had to bet on the cards that are out there today, where do you believe that movement's going to move? Do you believe it's going to continue to move towards the PPO realm, or is there going to be, a less risk position taken by the member and go to an HMO?
I mean, from the carrier's perspective, near term, there's been a push towards HMOs. So from a profitability standpoint, HMOs are, I think, better overall for carriers. And so, one example I'll point at is that United Healthcare's, where they dropped commissions July 1st, there's a lot of PPO plans. And, that's kind of signaling, like from their perspective, the PPO plans are less profitable. So I think in the near term, in general, the market is shifting more back towards the HMO plans. Whether that's a long-term thing, I don't know. I mean, I think the consumers like the PPO plans, right? So,
right. Well, they have more choice.
They have more choice. So I think in a compressed margin environment, from the health plans perspective, PPOs are harder.
Okay. Well, this one's going to be a little bit more challenging, I think, for you, especially what's going on recently. Given the current political climate, what is the single most impactful policy shift you anticipate affecting Medicare Advantage plans in 2025? And how should plans begin preparing for it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can answer it specifically to 2025, but I think the biggest one I mentioned a little bit, one of the bigger ones just has to do with Medicaid funding and and kind of the downstream impacts to DSNP plans. So, this most recent bill really cuts out quite a bit of Medicaid funding. And as a result, I think fewer people will be eligible for Medicaid kind of over the next, 5 years. And therefore, fewer people will be eligible for DSNP plans. And I do think that's going to be potentially, a big impact on the market.
Is there any other questions out there? Oh, we did have one more. We heard about the data driving plan decisions for 2026. Can you elaborate on one specific market implication that might surprise health plans stemming from these political shifts?
I mean, I think the data that's definitely driving, health plans decisions really relates to, again, going back to profitability. So, as plans are looking across all their products, and their overall margins are being compressed, the thing that they're doing is saying, okay, well, are there any areas where we're, really unprofitable? And so if we, remove those products from our portfolio, that will really help improve our profitability overall. And I definitely think that's kind of one of the drivers of plan development and strategic plans as we head into 2026 is, okay, how do we pull up our profitability? Obviously they're trying to do a few things. They're trying to do that, but they also are looking. They also don't want to completely, impact the consumer, to an extreme level. And so, what's the intersection between we want to impact as few as we can, but where are the areas that we can increase profitability by either removing some benefits or reducing plans from specific areas? I think all those things are definitely driven by data.
Any other questions out there? Nope, we got one more. From WEX's perspective, Rod, how does the ability to offer a flexible benefit card solution help health plans navigate these changes? First of all, it allows for what's going on in the marketplace today with the things that are changing and how, like Jared talked about, DSNP, some of the things going away. Those are all programs that help our chronic state seniors out there. And some of those funds are going to go away. So through some of the flexible benefit card programs that are out there, I think there's going to be additional capabilities to get resources and funds out there to help them continue to manage that chronic state, as well as mitigate it in a lot of cases. So I think it's going to be a key position to be able to do that rather than have to run it through some of these other standard DSNP programs that are out there. Any other questions? With that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We're going to put on the screen here pretty quick the avenue to follow Jared. If you aren't following him already, I would highly recommend it. Thank you for all the work you do, Jared. The information you put out makes my job easier, makes my conversations with the people I'm getting in front of easier. So I personally want to tell you thank you. And the information is tremendous. So if you're not following Jared, big mistake. Jump on it, take the QR code and start following. My information as well, if you want to follow the campfire research information and my pathways, I post as I'm out there traveling and hitting the campsites. And this is going to be a series that we're producing here. Jared, on the first part here, produced a lot from the hardcore numbers that he's working up through his actuarial base. The next one we're going to do in the next couple months will be based on what I find out, and Jared will run color on the backside of it. And I will be posting some of the findings that I'm finding out there in front of it. And just so everybody out there knows, the basis behind this campfire research is just that. We're out there with a camper and a pickup, traveling the country, going to campsites, inviting Medicare members to come over and share their Medicare experiences and interests and needs and wants, as well as their personal stories. And that gets back to, I'm going to conclude this with Jared opening with his dad. I hope everybody on here, takes this away and understands that this should not be a monetary thing. This should be a memberized thing. These people have worked for this. They deserve it. They're the greatest generation that I know of and that I've experienced and got a chance to talk to. And it's been life-changing for me to get in front of so many. So feel free to keep track of us, and we'll be posting more of when the next webinar will be. But again, thank you for your time, everybody that's participated. And Jared, a special thanks to you for taking time out of your day and give us your insights.
Yep. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, everybody.